Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar on Outstandingly Remarkable Values. This is the 5th of 6 webinars in our 2022 Wild and Scenic webinar series. In today's webinar, we're going to learn about the criteria used to determine whether a value qualifies as an outstandingly remarkable value. And we're also going to go through a little case study. But first, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Angie Furman, and I'm the River Training Center Coordinator for River Management Society. I'm going to be helping moderate today's session along with my colleague Risa Shimoda, who's behind the scenes. And just real quick, for those who are new to River Management Society, we support individuals who study, protect, and manage North America's rivers through communication, outreach, training, and sharing of resources. So encourage you to go check us out. Membership allows you to stay connected and up to date with what's happening in your field and related areas of river management. Well, a few things before we get started. You're going to notice that you have your GoToWebinar control panel there, and you're going to see a little tab labeled questions. Here's the spot where you can share questions or comments with us today and today's presenters. So you can type them into that box. And then we're also going to have some time today at the end of the webinar to answer your questions. We also have a handout that goes along with today's webinar with some helpful links as well as the contact information of today's presenters. You can find that under the handout tab. And then also just want to let you know that we are recording today's presentation and it'll be emailed out to all of you tomorrow. It's also going to be available on the RMS video channel, which you can access by going to our webpage, river-management.org, going to training and events, and then going down to the River Training channel. Also, when you go there, you're going to find all the videos from our previous webinars in the series. And in each video description, you'll find PDF links to copies of the slides as well as the handouts. Also, if you're interested in more information about today's topic, I encourage you to go check out the Wild and Scenic Rivers course of study on rivers.gov. This is a free and self-directed learning resource that can be accessed by anyone. You just have to go to that resources tab and then click on WSR training modules. I also encourage you to poke around that website. There's a lot of great information housed there. All right, without further ado, I'd like to invite today's presenters, Liz, Steve, and Trevor, to introduce themselves. Really excited to have them here. So how about Liz, we'll start with you.
Sure, thanks, Angie. Hi there, my name is Liz Townley, and I am a Wilderness and Wild and Scenic Rivers Planner with the Forest Service Washington office. I've been in this line of work, working between the BLM or the Forest Service for about 15 years, and I live in Salmon, Idaho.
Thanks, Liz. How about Steve?
Thanks, Angie. Hi, everyone. My name is Steve Chesterton. I am also with the U.S. Forest Service on the Wilderness and Wild and Scenic Rivers staff in the Washington office and serve as the Wild and Scenic Rivers National Program Manager. I've been with that staff for a little over 10 years now and also serve as one of the Forest Service representatives on the Interagency Wild and Scenic Rivers Coordinating Council. And I'm based in the DC area.
Thanks, Steve. And how about Trevor?
Hi, everyone. My name is Trevor Robinson, and I'm a recreation planner with the U.S. Forest Service. I work on the Siuslaw National Forest in Western Oregon, Oregon Coast Range. I'm based out of Corvallis, and the Siuslaw manages 2 wild and scenic rivers, and I'll be sharing a little bit of a case study on those during the final segment of today's webinar. So great to be here, and thank you for joining us.
All right, now that we've heard a little bit from our presenters, we'd love to know a little bit more about who is joining us in the audience today. So we welcome you to go over to that questions tab and share with us your name, where you're from, What is your position, and what is your favorite wild and scenic river? I guess I can share real quick while we're waiting for some things to come in, because I didn't share quite where I'm from. Again, my name is Angie Furman, and I am in Southern Oregon, in the Applegate Valley. And I'm the River Training Center coordinator for RMS, and my favorite wild and scenic river probably has to be the Rogue River here in my backyard, because I get to spend a lot of time, and I've seen it in a lot of different times of the year. And recently I got to do a high water trip down the Rogue River, which was really fun and exciting to see all the waterfalls coming down. And I see we've got Emily joining us from Rogue River Keeper. The Rogue is clearly her favorite, and she's in Jacksonville and also just rafted on the Rogue. Awesome, Emily. And we've got Sheena with the Three Forks of the Flathead, Ryan Kelly with the Yosemite Conservancy, and Merced Wild and Scenic River. That's a good one too. Monica, the Region 5 of the Forest Service. Debbie in Iowa, volunteer with the Sierra Club, and Jack's Fork. Awesome. Well, thank you all for sharing a little bit. We're excited to have you here today. And now I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Steve.
Thanks, Angie. So I'm going to kick things off here today with a little bit of an overview. For folks that have joined previous webinars or are familiar with the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, this might be a little bit of a repeat for you, but wanted to at least lay the groundwork for diving into more details about outstanding and remarkable values, including what Liz and Trevor will discuss later in the webinar. But to start things off here, you see a few photos of some key figures in the movement to ultimately pass the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, in particular Frank and John Craighead, who were wildlife biologists that advocated for the establishment of a national system of wild rivers, in particular spurred by a Army Corps of Engineers dam proposal on the Middle Fork of the Flathead River in Montana in the 1950s. Then you also see First Lady Lady Bird Johnson and Department of Interior Secretary Stuart Udall, who discussed national conservation efforts while they were rafting on the Snake River through Grand Teton National Park in Wyoming in the mid-1960s. And those conversations ultimately led to President Lyndon Johnson to sign 4 conservation bills into law on October 2nd, 1968, including the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act and the National Trail System Act. And so we actually have a clip to share from the signing ceremony on October 2nd, 1968 that we're going to share with you now.
And I am just going to make a quick note that it's just an audio clip. So if you don't see anything, that is what is supposed to be happening. So just want to make that note real quick.
So I am signing an act today which preserves sections of selected rivers that possess outstanding conservation values. An unspoiled river is a very rare thing in this nation today. Their flow and their vitality have been harnessed by dams, and too often they've been turned into open sewers by communities and by industries. And it makes us all very fearful that all rivers will go this way unless somebody acts now to try to balance our river development. So we are establishing a national Wild and Scenic River System, which will complement our river development with a policy to preserve sections of selected rivers in their free-flowing conditions and to protect their water quality and to protect other vital conservation values. The National Wild and Scenic Rivers System Act will give immediate protection to portions of 8 rivers and a ribbon of land along each river bank.
So as you heard President Johnson speak to in that act, in that clip, the act established a national system for wild and scenic rivers, and that system was focused on complementing what at the time was a national policy of dam construction to balance that with a system of preservation or protection enhancement of select rivers, in particular in their free-flowing condition. 8 rivers were designated initially upon the signing of the act in 1968, as well as 27 rivers for study for potential inclusion. Next slide, please.
Sorry, Steve, it's coming.
So the system itself has grown over the years through primarily acts of Congress to designate more rivers. And you can see in the graph here, the green line and the bottom line is numbers of rivers designated by year, with the blue line being the cumulative total number of designated rivers across the national system to date. And so you can see it's grown quite a bit, but in spurts over the years, and in particular that's due to some key pieces of legislation such as the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act in 1980, the Oregon Wild and Scenic Rivers Act in 1988, the Omnibus Public Lands Management Act of 2009, and then most recently the Dingle Act in 2019. Next slide, please. And so coupled with the numbers of rivers designated, we have miles of rivers designated. And this map here is a depiction of all the river miles in the United States, and a base layer in blue of what totals up to about 3.5 million miles. And of those, approximately 860,000 depicted in red or orangish red, 860,000 miles have been dammed, dredged, or channelized. And so the Wild and Scenic River System, again, meant to be a complement to the development of rivers. That total right now is 13,413 miles, which totals up to a little bit less than 0.4% of all the river miles in the United States. Next slide, please. So one of the core pieces of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act is what's known as the Protection and Enhancement Mandate. And that lies in Section 10 of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act that you see here on this slide, requiring each component of the National Wild and Scenic River System to be administered in such a manner as to protect and enhance the values which caused it to be included in the system. Next slide. And so what are those values? Well, the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act also spells out the particular values to be protected and enhanced. And those are free-flowing condition, water quality, and outstandingly remarkable values. Next slide. So free-flowing, that's, again, sort of this complement to the policy of development of rivers, both from a dam standpoint and other channelization and development along river banks. Free-flowing is meant and has a definition in the Act which highlights existing or flowing in a natural condition without impoundment, diversion, straightening, riprapping, or other modification of the waterway. And that's not to say that there can't be any sort of existing modification of the waterway in order to qualify as free-flowing or certain segments. But that is ultimately the definition in the Act for that river value. Next slide. So the second river value highlighted in the act is water quality, called out under the policy at the beginning of the act, policy that would preserve these rivers in the national system or sections of river in their free-flowing condition again, but to protect the water quality. There's also a provision in the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, Section 12C, that calls for the cooperation among the federal river administering agencies with EPA and state water quality agencies to eliminate or diminish the pollution of waters of designated rivers. And this was in 1968, which predated the modern Clean Water Act. Next slide. And then we come to the focus of the webinar here today, outstandingly remarkable values. That language, it comes directly from Section 1B of the Act. Again, it calls out the policy of establishing the National Wild and Scenic River System and the passage of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, that certain selected rivers of the nation with their immediate environments possess these outstandingly remarkable scenic, recreational, geologic, fish and wildlife, historic, cultural, and other similar values. Next slide. So, outstandingly remarkable values, when you put that together, that's a bit of a superlative on top of a superlative, and not necessarily a term that we use readily, but it has specific significance in this act. And in some ways, it's similar to the unorthodox nature of the use of the term untrammeled in the Wilderness Act. Not a commonly used term, but has significance and was identified in that act for a particular meaning. Same goes for outstandingly remarkable values. It's a mouthful, but it has important meaning under the act. And so, because it's so long, we tend to shorten it and refer to it as ORVs. They're short. And no, not these ORVs, but just in case there's to alleviate any confusion here, we're talking about, when we refer to ORVs, we're talking about outstandingly remarkable values. But I will say, anyone who can correctly identify in the chat the 1980s band or song featured in this music video clip will ultimately be declared the winner of this webinar today. So we'll circle back to that one at the end of the webinar. But for here, we'll focus on the other ORVs, outstandingly remarkable values. And as I mentioned earlier, as the text of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act highlights, there's a number of categories of outstandingly remarkable values. And in particular, along with the list of ORVs identified in the Act that you see here, there's also this category of other similar values, which is not defined by the Act, but has been interpreted to include resources such as botany, hydrology, paleontology, heritage, ecology, among others. Next slide, please. So speaking of those among others, have a bit of trivia here to pose to this group. There's a Wild and Scenic River designation that actually has a literary heritage ORV. And that was put in place, identified, because this particular river, or this particular designation of Wild and Scenic Rivers, inspired the works of such writers as Ralph Waldo Emerson, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Henry David Thoreau. So if you know the answer, have a guess, put it in the chat, and we'll come back at the end of the webinar to see if anyone was able to correctly guess the answer to this literary heritage ORV trivia question. Next slide. So why do we need to identify ORVs? Why is this important? Well, as I just mentioned, the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act requires that ORVs be protected and enhanced. And so in order to do that effectively, we need to know what those ORVs are and where they're located. And in particular, these values, which are tailored to each designation, ultimately guide the future management actions of the Wild and Scenic River, including the development of Wild and Scenic River corridor final boundaries, which are designed to best set up a system for protection and enhancement of river values. Also establishes the baseline for monitoring, informing processes such as user capacity analyses and Federal Reserve water rights quantifications that associated with Wild and Scenic River designations. And then they're also central to evaluating the potential adverse impacts of proposed water resources projects under Section 7 of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. And so we need to be able to identify and understand these specific ORVs, which are different than the other river values, because other river values, free flowing condition, water quality, that's those are required for every designation. The specifics of ORVs, those are customized for each Wild and Scenic River. And so it's the intent there is to manage, in order to manage a river as a Wild and Scenic River, you need to be able to identify and then develop a management approach specifically tailored to the outstandingly remarkable values of a given river. Next slide, please. So there's a couple different contexts for identifying ORVs, and I should say here at this point that we've got with Liz, Trevor, and I, 3 Forest Service employees. This presentation is tailored a little bit more towards Forest Service policy language, but the vast majority of what we'll be talking about is very similar to other Federal River Administration agency policies, as well as the information provided in the Interagency Wild and Scenic River Coordinating Council's Wild and Scenic River Study Process Technical Paper, and some of the other supporting materials linked to in this webinar handout. But there are some nuances between Forest Service, National Park Service, Bureau of Land Management, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service policies. Ultimately, the Interagency Council tries to promote consistent understanding and has been successful in that. But just wanted to acknowledge that this has a little bit more of a Forest Service policy-focused feel to it, but ultimately very consistent with the other agencies as well. So 2 contexts for identifying ORVs. One is eligibility evaluations, when rivers are evaluated for study, either when Congress authorizes that a river be evaluated for future study, just like was done initially with those 27 study rivers, and it's been done over the course of subsequent years, or when an agency such as the Forest Service identifies rivers for study through their land management planning processes, and other agencies have similar processes as well to inventory and evaluate these rivers for potential candidacy and in particular eligibility for future designation. And those inventories are focused on 2 things. One, whether rivers are free flowing, and one, whether they possess at least one ORV. And so that's one of the contexts, or the pre-designation context for identifying ORVs. The other context is at the resource assessment phase, oftentimes after designation, to inform the development of a comprehensive river management plan, which is required for every congressionally designated wild and scenic river. And so in particular, if rivers hadn't been studied for eligibility previously, or even if they had, it's an opportunity to revisit and update and ultimately determine the ORVs that are going to form the core basis for management of a designated river. And sometimes legislation will identify ORVs for a particular river, but that may not always be the case. So in either case, we proceed with this process to ultimately inform comprehensive river management plans. Next slide, please. So ORVs ultimately come down to being river related and values that are unique, rare, or exemplary within the region of comparison. And so I'll go a little bit more into each of those factors and what they mean. So river-related values owe their existence to the presence of the river itself. It contributes substantially to the function of the river system or are considered river dependent. And usually they're located within the river or its immediate shorelands. Some examples you see here relate to river recreation or fish and wildlife habitat, riparian plants, cultural sites that are associated with the existence of the river, as well as scenic views both of and from the river, and geological formations created or exposed by the river are other examples of river-related values. Next slide, please. And then when we come to the unique, rare, or exemplary aspect of ORVs and what makes them outstandingly remarkable river values is ultimately what we're trying to determine here. You see a few different examples on the slide, what each means, unique being one of a kind or unequaled, could be a particular rapid in the region or habitat for listed species that is really one of its kind in the region of comparison, which I'll get to in a minute here, what that means. Rare being uncommon or unusual, occurring infrequently, such as a well-preserved site of prehistoric river settlement, or exemplary, in other words, significant or conspicuous example that's among the best representatives of its kind, again, in the region of comparison, like karst geology or diverse scenery, a number of different geographic environments. Next slide, please. So the region of comparison, so that is key there when looking at identifying unique, rare, or exemplary values. And this is a comparative unit that is identified by the interdisciplinary team that is evaluating outstandingly remarkable values for each category of ORVs, ultimately informed by input, but it's a professional judgment process to determine each categories. One of the core components there to be thinking about is that these regions of comparison should be scaled at an appropriate level for the type of river being evaluated. So large enough to encompass similar river types that provide a wide representation of river values to ultimately get at this sense of identifying unique, rare, or exemplary values. Next slide, please. So these regions of comparison, they're not necessarily uniform across all of our evaluation processes, and they can even differ within across ORV categories within the same evaluation process. It could range from a management unit like a national forest or a state, could be hydrologic or physiographic in nature, at an ecoregion or multi-state level. Could also be dependent on the use patterns, traditional indigenous use, populations served by recreation opportunities, and or species range, used by a listed species in their range of habitat. But note, as I mentioned earlier, this region of comparison can be, but does not need to be the same for each river-related value. It can vary across river values and is ultimately tiered towards what is meaningful for evaluating that particular value. Next slide, please. So these determinations that are made are ultimately supported by the interdisciplinary team of resource experts using their professional judgment and informed by the best available scientific information and public participation. In order to, for that professional judgment to be informed, critical steps involve seeking tribal input as well as that of other federal, state, and local agencies, as well as members of the public, individuals, organizations, and in particular those familiar with specific river resources that could really inform the ORV determination process. Next slide, please. So these processes are not static; they're not uniform across all management units, but will vary somewhat according to, again, the unique needs and attributes associated with specific river resources, or identifying the specific unique qualities of these rivers, and so it's ultimately needs to be tailored to creating a meaningful process to do so. Ultimately, though, that process and those findings should be replicable and defensible, and support findings with concise ORV descriptions and documentation that explains the rationale for the determinations. Next slide, please. So just a quick recap of what I've gone over to start here. ORVs are one of the 3 river values under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act that must be protected and enhanced. These outstandingly remarkable values are identified through either study processes pre-designation, or to inform comprehensive river management plans post-designation. These values must be river related and unique, rare, or exemplary within their region of comparison. And then they must use, in order to develop these determinations, involves an interdisciplinary team using informed professional judgment that is concluded with a documented process, both for how and why the conclusion was reached, and how public and other entities consulted informed that process. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Liz to tee up another trivia question here and take it from here.
Thanks, Steve. Okay, so now that you've gotten a good basis about ORVs, I'm going to walk you through the ORV categories in a little bit more detail and provide some examples. But first, let's hit this trivia question. So please enter into your chat which Wild and Scenic River is believed to be one of the oldest rivers in North America, if not the world. So we'll just take a moment here and give me your best guess, or maybe you know it.
I saw Monica got it with the New River.
There you go. Thanks, Angie. Yeah, so if you entered the New River Gorge, then you are correct. A favorite river, the New has 26.5 miles of designated Wild and Scenic River and flows through the Appalachian Mountains in North Carolina, Virginia, and West Virginia, and is estimated to be 260 to 325 million years old. So not new at all. Okay, next slide, Angie. Okay, so I know Steve already went through the categories of ORVs, but again, it's worth just looking at one more time here. So a river segment needs to only possess one of these values, but it can contain more than one. So as I mentioned in the following slides, we're going to describe all of these criteria that are used to determine whether a value qualifies as an outstandingly remarkable value, and share some of my favorite examples of ORVs. Okay, so Scenic. So the landscape elements of landform, vegetation, water, color, and or other related factors may result in notable or exemplary visual features or attractions on the landscape. When analyzing scenic values, additional factors such as seasonal variations in vegetation, scale of cultural modifications, and the length of time of negative intrusions are viewed may be considered. So it's important to remember that just because a stream corridor is pretty does not make it an ORV. Remember, the scenery must be river related. So for example, mountains in the distance may be very scenic, but are likely not river related. In contrast, colorful canyon walls carved by the river are good examples of scenic ORVs. So a couple of other good examples are pictured here. So if you've ever been to the upper Missouri River in Montana, then you know these iconic cliffs. They are the only whitewashed cliff system in the Great Plains province of the Missouri Plateau, making this scenery very unique and exemplary. The photo on the right is East Rosebud in Montana. Definitely one of the most scenic rivers I've been to. The wild section parallels the beaten path trail and carves through a rather dramatic canyon laced with waterfalls and many sapphire colored lakes. Okay, so for the recreation ORV, recreational opportunities within the river corridor should have the potential to attract visitors from throughout or beyond the region of comparison, or should be unique or rare within the region. So most people think of the recreation ORV as rafting or kayaking, but river-related ORVs can also include sightseeing, wildlife observation, camping, photography, hiking, fishing, hunting, other types of boating, or a combination of these activities and experiences. The recreational opportunity may be an outstandingly remarkable value without the underlying recreational resource being an outstandingly remarkable value. Okay, so what I mean by that is that you can have fishing as the basis for a recreational ORV without having the fish species itself or habitat be an ORV. Okay, some good examples of rivers with a recreational ORV include the Maine salmon in Idaho, pictured right. So what makes the recreational experience unique, rare, or exemplary is the 80 miles of free-flowing river in the heart of the Frank Church River of No Return wilderness. So this provides a multi-day trip, generally 5 or 6 days in length, with campsites on big sandy beaches. And the water provides a mix of challenge with numerous rapids, but is also family friendly, making this ideal stretch for families looking for quality time outside. So despite being in the same region of comparison with the adjoining Middle Fork River and Lower Salmon, they all have recreation ORVs, but for very different reasons. So a unique perspective to think about when considering the recreation ORV. And pictured left is the Red River in Kentucky. This river has a recreation ORV for exceptional hiking, backcountry camping, kayaking, and canoeing. Additionally, an exceptional experience for visitors to the Red River Gorge is to experience more than the 100 natural sandstone arches. Some say this is the largest concentration of arches east of the Mississippi River. Additionally, there are more than 600 known rock shelters located along the Red River, and some of these shelters are more than 11,000 years old. All right, so geology. A geologic ORV must be the result of a hydrologic process associated with the river. A prominent geologic feature that was not influenced by the hydrologic process should not be identified as an ORV. So again, it must be river related. All right, so some good examples of the geologic ORV is pictured left is the Narrows on the Virgin River in Utah. When compared to streams in the Canyon Plateau geologic area between Zion and Glen Canyon, the Virgin River contains exceptionally deep and narrow slot canyons that were created by accelerated rates of erosion through sandstone formations, making this a great geologic ORV. pictured right is the largest piece of obsidian I've ever seen, regardless, but also located next to the Owens River headwaters near Mammoth, California. There's significant geologic evidence of volcanic activity along the Owens River headwaters that makes a clear connection to unique river-related geologic features, such as craters, obsidian domes and flats, the Glass Creek flow, a caldera, and locatable pumice. When I was out there a few years ago walking along the river, I picked up handfuls of pumice, obsidian, and big chunks of sulfur. So it was a really unique experience to be able to see the geology right on the banks of the river as well. All right, fish. So fish values include either indigenous fish populations or habitat or a combination of the two. So for the fish populations criteria, the river should be a nationally or regionally important producer of indigenous resident and or anadromous fish species. Of particular significance is the presence of wild stocks and or federally or state listed or candidate threatened, endangered, or sensitive species. Diversity of species is an important consideration and could in itself lead to a determination of an outstandingly remarkable value. For the habitat criteria, the river should provide exceptional high quality habitat for fish species indigenous to the region of comparison. Of particular significance is habitat, again, for wild stocks and or federally or state listed candidate, threatened, endangered, or sensitive species. And also, again, diversity of habitat is an important consideration and could in itself lead to a determination that it is an outstandingly remarkable value. Okay, so here's a picture of one of my new favorite fish ORVs. This is on Cottonwood Creek in Eastern California. And the story goes about 5,000 years ago, a population of Lahontan cutthroats in the Eastern Sierras were isolated from each other from a large landslide. And so the upstream population over time adapted to local conditions independent of the population below. So this small population, the one up above, became known as the Paiute cutthroat trout. Progeny of this population survives in the creek today and have formed a self-sustaining population, one of only 5 known in existence today, thus making this an important fishery and a fish ORV on Cottonwood Creek. Okay, so similar to the fish ORV, wildlife values include either terrestrial or aquatic wildlife populations or habitat or a combination of these conditions. For the populations criteria, the river or area within the river corridor should contain nationally or regionally important populations of indigenous wildlife species dependent on the river environment. Of particular significance are species considered to be unique to the area and or populations of federal or state listed or candidate, threatened, endangered, or sensitive species. That's a mouthful. Diversity of species is an important consideration and, like fish, could in itself lead to a determination that it is an outstandingly remarkable value. Okay, so a good example of the wildlife ORV is the Three Forks of the Flathead, which lies at the heart of the 5.7 million acre Northern Continental Divide ecosystem, an area with the largest population of grizzly bears in the lower 48. The Flathead River corridor plays a key role in promoting connectivity of grizzly habitat across the international boundary with the crown of the continent ecosystem, and allows for genetic interchange between subpopulations of grizzly bears. And this is a good example of the wildlife habitat. So this image shows the largest intact cottonwood riparian forest habitat in the Western United States. The bald eagle, once listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act, and the yellow-billed cuckoo, listed as threatened, rely on these cottonwood galleries for habitat. The historic ORV. So the river or area within the river corridor has scientific value or contains a rare or outstanding example of a district, a site, a building or structure that is associated with an event, person, or a distinctive style. Likely candidates include sites that are eligible for the National Register of Historic Places at the national level or have been designated a National Historic Landmark by the Secretary of Interior. A great example of the historic ORV is the Pecos River in New Mexico. This is a good example of a river with historic values because the river itself is the setting for many frontier folklore. There are historic structures that still exist today, including the cabin pictured here, which is Beatty's Cabin. But also adding to the historic value of the area are the early 20th century cemeteries, sawmills, cabins, and campground structures built by the Civilian Conservation Corps. The cultural ORV. Okay, so the cultural ORV, the criteria is that the river or area within the river corridor contains rare or outstanding examples of historic or prehistoric locations of human activity, occupation, use, including traditional, cultural, or religious importance to specific social and or cultural groups. So waterways have been important to people since time immemorial. So cultural river values can be found across the wild and scenic river system, from bow staves to granaries, points and flakes to pictographs and petroglyphs, like the example shown here on the Green River from the Fremont culture. So the last category of ORV is other. And while no specific national evaluation guidelines have been developed for the other similar values category, assessments of additional river-related values may be developed. A good example of the other ORV is again on the Flathead system. So beyond archaeology are the values particular to people who hold specific places. These lands of the Flathead headwaters are within the traditional homelands of the Kootenai, Salish, and Pend Oreille people. And these areas are of outstanding ethnographic significance because the waters are pristine, the plants are healthy, and the spirit of the place is intact. The quality is exceedingly rare and exceptional cultural value for people who believe that spiritual, physical, mental, and social values are interconnected to form a complete circle. Places like the upper stretches of the middle and south forks of the Flathead hold great cultural significance because their remoteness has protected them. So for communities that define their homelands in relation to particular watersheds, pristine headwaters are one of the signs of vitality for the community of life within the entire system. Making this a really great example of a river value that isn't captured in the traditional list, but contains really special ethnographic values. So a few other examples of river values that fall within the category of other include paleontology, hydrology, climate refugia, ecology, maybe a dark skies ORV, and then we even have that literary ORV that Steve mentioned earlier. Okay, so we just covered the basics for the criteria for all the ORVs and some examples. So what are the key points to remember? All ORVs must be river related. All ORVs must be unique, rare, or exemplary in a regional context. And the rationale for why a value qualifies as an ORV must be carefully and comprehensively documented. And that documentation is something that we can't emphasize enough. It's important to document all of your findings concerning ORVs. You should be keeping records of all discussions concerning whether or not a value qualifies as an ORV, and a summary of those discussions should appear in your river values report. A detailed description of an ORV is a requirement because it provides the foundation of your management plan for the stream reach. And you'll be managing the stream reach to maintain and enhance those values that you describe. All right, so what are some tips for writing good descriptions, you might be wondering. So when writing ORV descriptions, remember that the goal is not to simply describe existing conditions and uses in the river. Rather, the goal is to describe how is the value related to the river? How is the value unique or exemplary within a regional or national context? How would you measure the value compared to values on other rivers, either quantitatively or qualitatively? And why would someone take special notice of this value? The ORV description also informs, though, the management decisions for activities within the river and the management direction in the river plan, and assists with the development of the monitoring plan. Therefore, the ORVs must be described in detail. So when deciding what details to include, consider the following questions. What aspects of the value can future river managers examine to know if the value is being maintained? What resource conditions are necessary for continued existence of the value? What outcomes and experiences are river users having that are an important part of the value? And what is the current condition and trend of that value? So why is this important? Let's say someone picks up your river value report or your CRMP 10 years from now. Well, you just spent a year or however long it was going through an interdisciplinary and citizen, stakeholder, tribal engagement, collaborative process where you discussed river values, identified specific features that create the basis for the ORV. If you do not document this, what may end up happening as a result is someone picks up that plan or your report and actually doesn't understand the significance of some of the values. And this is something that we see quite often. And this can dramatically alter the management, monitoring of the river and associated values, and can result in poor management and missed opportunities. So more really can be best when evaluating and documenting ORVs. So I won't spend too much time on desired conditions. I know Trevor's going to give you some more context around this later on, but I'll just say that writing and documenting good ORVs is also the basis to then developing desired conditions for these ORVs. Desired conditions is a very specific planning term, often used in forest planning or resource management planning if you're with the BLM, but it can also be used in a more general sense, just to manage any natural resource. Simply put, desired conditions identify what the desired future condition is for a resource. These are goal statements and should be specific enough that they paint a picture of what we, by we I mean the public, of course, the Forest Service partners and stakeholders, desire for the forest to look like, or the resource to look like. We could spend an entire session on desired conditions. There are a lot that can go into writing good condition statements, just like there's a lot that goes into writing good goal statements. But the best way to learn about desired conditions is to look at examples and talk about them. And I know Trevor will go into that in a little bit. So some management considerations for your ORVs. How can you know if you're reaching your desired conditions? If you are protecting and enhancing your river values? You really cannot manage for ORVs without monitoring. Monitoring is often the forgotten piece of all natural resource planning. Your plan can be great no matter what it is, but if you don't check in, excuse me, and monitor conditions and apply adaptive management practices, then you're going to likely wake up one day to a very out-of-date plan with complex resource conditions that could have been addressed or modified years ago. Additionally, monitoring is interdisciplinary. So many people think about wild and scenic river monitoring and think about floating the river or counting people. And that can certainly be part of it, but each river value likely has some monitoring component to it. So monitoring cultural sites should be done in concert with local archaeology staff, fisheries with an aquatic team, and so on. Each resource specialist should know what an ORV is and being included in the design and implementation of monitoring. Go ahead. I was just going to talk about this picture. It shows snorkeling for reds on the middle fork of the Salmon. And this is done collaboratively with outfitters, members of the public, fish and game, fisheries staff, in addition to Wild and Scenic River staff. Okay, so another management consideration that we've been talking quite a bit about is climate change. So climate change is in the headlines of most media these days, and for good reason, as changing weather patterns are disrupting the balance of nature and posing many risks to humans and all other forms of life on Earth. And so as we think about ORVs and how we are required to manage these values to protect and enhance the values for which they were designated, we begin to test how we might do that in the face of a changing climate and landscape. What I mean by that is, how do we manage these values if they are changing, diminishing, or in some cases completely gone? For example, a tributary to the designated Elkhorn River, the Little North Santiam River, is pictured here. And this is what it looks like before the Beachy Creek fire of 2020, and then during the fire. The fire itself was 200,000 acres and burned nearly the entire designated stretch of the Elkhorn River. So for the scenery, fisheries, and wildlife values of the Elkhorn, how does our management action shift as a result of fire or as a result of a changing climate? Fire is the most obvious in our line of work, but when you really start to think about it, changes in climate can cause, migration of entire species, drought, changes in recreation use and patterns, flooding, increases in soil temperature, and many other changes, that are playing out on our landscape and on our watersheds. So this isn't necessarily a problem that we can solve right now or today. Rather, how do we and when do we and how can we be both proactive and reactive in management actions to continue to support these vital resources? I certainly don't have all the answers. This is something that our staff is prioritizing right now, but just having the conversation with your own staff and your own networks and start taking next steps in adaptation plans, recovery plans, or management actions can be a next step. Pictured here is a Google Earth image of Elkhorn. The top was pre-Beachy fire, and you can see, just how green that is. That's pretty typical for that corner of the world. And then below was post-Beachy fire. So I think this really depicts what some of these large-scale fires or other changes that I mentioned earlier are doing to our landscapes and our watersheds. Again, one more slide just to show this. This is the Elkhorn in 2019. It's got old growth, canopy cover, dead and down woody debris. It's got the presence of a native mollusk and a sensitive caddisfly. The mollusk is not found anywhere. It's endemic to the Elkhorn. And post-fire in 2021, none of these exist at the current moment. And this is the same reach of river. Okay, so that's it for my section of the presentation. I'm going to pass it over to Trevor to talk a little bit more about a specific example that he's been working on. But before we do, we're going to end with one more trivia break. So what is the name of the only underground wild and scenic river? If you want to pop that in the chat, that would be great. Okay, well, hopefully we have a few folks entering that into the chat. If you guessed the river Styx, you would be correct. This is a subterranean segment of Cave Creek that flows through the Oregon Caves National Monument and was designated a wild and scenic river and is administered by the National Park Service. With that, I'll pass it over to Trevor.
All right, thanks, Liz. Once again, sorry about that, team. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Trevor Robinson again, and I'm a recreation planner with the U.S. Forest Service. I work for the Siuslaw National Forest in Corvallis, Oregon. I'm going to be talking about the river values assessment and then the outstandingly remarkable values for Wasson Creek Wild and Scenic River and Franklin Creek Wild and Scenic River. So first, I'll go over a little bit of background. The Siuslaw National Forest is located along the northern and central Oregon coasts. Most of this forest's land base is in the Oregon Coast Range, and we also manage several areas right along the coastline. Wasson Creek and Franklin Creek are located at the south end of the forest in Douglas County, about 15 miles inland from the coastline. Here's another map showing the location of the planning area within the state of Oregon, and then a map that zooms in on Wasson Creek and Franklin Creek with the surrounding land management designations. Wasson Creek Wild and Scenic River is 10.1 miles long and is jointly managed by the U.S. Forest Service in light green and the Bureau of Land Management in tan. And then Franklin Creek is 4.5 miles long, and its entire length is managed by the Forest Service. All of Franklin Creek and most of Wasson Creek are within the Devil's Staircase Wilderness, which is the area enclosed within the red boundary. And both Wild and Scenic Rivers, as well as the Wilderness, were all designated by the Dingle Act in 2019. So these are all very new designations, and the comprehensive planning process for the Wild and Scenic Rivers is still underway. It's nearly wrapped up, but we have not yet officially finalized those planning documents. So talking about the planning area in just a little bit more detail, Wasson Creek and Franklin Creek are located in a remote and rugged portion of the Oregon Coast Range. The nearby landscape is characterized by steep slopes, undisturbed old growth vegetation, and numerous small tributary streams. There are very few roads in the vicinity of the planning area, and there are no developed boat launches, campgrounds, or day use facilities along either creek. There are also no official trails or developed trailheads in the vicinity of either creek drainage, though there are several user-created social trails and informal hiker access points down to Wasson Creek. Neither creek has any impoundments or other in-stream developments affecting free flow. Both creeks are experiencing natural or reference water quality conditions, and we're not currently aware of any human developments that are degrading water quality within the creek drainages. Both creeks provide high quality habitat for a variety of anadromous and resident fish species. And then the riparian and upland areas adjacent to the creeks provide undisturbed old growth habitat for a large number of birds, mammals, and amphibian species. There have been extensive timber operations in the Oregon Coast Range over the past century, but this particular area has been largely undisturbed by logging and road construction, and that's due to the area's extremely steep slopes and unstable soils. So as a result, we have these two creeks that are very much in a natural, undeveloped, and untrammeled wilderness condition. Wasson Creek and Franklin Creek are within the ancestral lands of several Native American tribes. We know this area is important to those tribes for traditional and cultural uses. We don't have much in the way of an archaeological survey record for the area because it's so rugged, and because there haven't really been any major ground disturbing actions in either drainage. In terms of recreation use, as I mentioned, the area doesn't have any developed facilities or official trails. Both creeks offer an outstanding opportunity for solitude and non-motorized recreation in a wilderness setting. In terms of numbers, visitation levels to this area are relatively low. For Wasson Creek, the main recreation feature is the Devil's Staircase waterfall, which attracts hikers with advanced backcountry skills. The waterfall is well known among that user group and has sort of a hidden gem reputation among the backcountry hiking community in the local area. It's a long, tough hike down from the top of the ridgeline to the waterfall and then back up again. But the folks who make the trip place a high value on that wilderness experience. And of course, Devil's Staircase Waterfall is the namesake of Devil's Staircase Wilderness. There's also a small lake along Wasson Creek called Wasson Lake, which attracts day and overnight use for fishing, picnicking, and camping. And it's a long drive to get to the lake, but once you get there, the dispersed site along the shoreline is about 0.2 miles from the road via a flat trail, so it's much more easily accessible. On the other hand, there is very little to no recreation use on Franklin Creek. We're not aware of any recreation attractions that are drawing people. There seems to be very limited dispersed use from activities such as fishing or hunting. So with those current conditions in mind, our river values assessment process began shortly after the creeks were designated as wild and scenic rivers. Our first step was to assemble any existing information about free flow, water quality, and potential ORVs. We were looking at internal agency information as well as materials published by other external sources. Next, we asked our staff to fill out a series of standardized river value worksheets. These worksheets follow an interagency template, and they're designed to help us summarize what we know about existing conditions, identify data gaps, and crucially, start thinking about whether the current conditions meet the thresholds for any ORVs. And because these creeks are so remote and rugged, we actually had a lot of information gaps when we first started preparing those worksheets. And there was a worksheet for every general ORV category. So the fish biologist filled out the fish worksheet, landscape architect filled out the scenery worksheet, and so on. Then staff from the Forest Service and BLM came together with the inventory worksheets to begin discussing potential ORVs. This was just a preliminary workshop, and it focused on sharing information and discussing potential conclusions and data gaps, identifying a potential region of comparison. After that initial workshop, we conducted some preliminary external engagement with tribes, agencies, non-governmental organizations, and individuals who are familiar with the planning area. Through that engagement, the agencies shared our initial ideas on river values, and we asked our external contacts if they had any feedback or any new information for us to consider. And that was a useful exercise for starting to refine our preliminary river value ideas. And then in August 2020, staff came back together for our official interdisciplinary river values workshop. That was the time when we brought all of our information and ideas together and then made our determinations on the ORVs. There was still some follow-up research to do afterwards, but we came away from that meeting with a pretty solid list of ORVs for Wasson Creek and Franklin Creek. And for those determinations, we used the standard ORV criteria for the most part, with the exception of an ecology ORV that I'll talk about in a few moments. After that workshop, we put together our river values report. I worked with each specialist to craft a write-up based on our research and our workshops, including our methodology, process, and conclusions. We did several rounds of review and revision on those sections. And once all the pieces were done, we put it all together in a formal report for the project record and for the comprehensive plan. And finally, when we moved into the planning process for the National Environmental Policy Act, we shared our river values report with the public during the scoping period. And that served as another opportunity for external review, input, and refinement of our river value determinations. For our region of comparison, our goal was to compare Wasson Creek and Franklin Creek to rivers and streams in a similar biophysical and social setting. As we were going through our river values assessment and workshops, we quickly recognized that we wanted to confine the region of comparison to the Oregon Coast Range, as opposed to including a larger area in Oregon or beyond. This is because the Oregon Coast Range has some distinctions in its topography, geology, hydrologic characteristics, and social setting. And because of those distinctions, we wanted to compare Wasson Creek and Franklin Creek to their peers within the Oregon Coast Range, rather than opening up the analysis to include the Willamette River Valley, the Oregon Cascades, or potentially beyond. And then as we dug deeper, we realized that we wanted to further narrow down the area because there were still some small but significant variations across the Coast Range as a whole. For example, for recreation, we were hesitant to include areas within sort of day trip distance of the Portland-Vancouver metro area, because that's a huge driver of recreation use patterns along the North Coast. But on the other hand, our planning area for Wasson and Franklin was getting its visitation from smaller cities in the Central Oregon Coast Range, the coast itself, and the Southern Willamette Valley, rather than the Portland metro area. So there were some small distinctions like that. So for all of our ORV categories, we ended up circling around kind of the Central Oregon Coast and Central Oregon Coast Range for our region of comparison. And we all eventually agreed on just using one region for all categories. And that region is actually defined by geology. It's the boundaries of the Tyee Sandstone Formation. So again, if it's based in geology, and those geological properties influence some other factors that directly contribute to our river values and current conditions, such as hydrology, soil characteristics, and vegetation. The boundaries of the Tyee Formation also nicely lined up with a distinct social setting for the Central Oregon coast. So it made sense for recreation to also tie into the same biophysical region of comparison. And then the boundaries of that region are shown on the map on the left side of the slide. So based on our analysis, we identified 5 outstandingly remarkable values for Wasson Creek and 4 for Franklin Creek. All of our ORV determinations connected back to the creek's wilderness setting and lack of modern human development and intervention in some way. There were some important distinctions in the current conditions of the 2 creeks, but there were also a number of key similarities, and that kind of is borne out in our ORV determinations. For both creeks, we identified ORVs for scenery, fish populations and habitat, beaver habitat, and ecological systems. And then again, we were looking at some similarities in current conditions, but then some differences, and ultimately we ended up on similar determinations for those 4 categories. And then Wasson Creek also has a primitive recreation ORV in recognition of the wilderness recreation setting and the backcountry use associated with Devil's Staircase. So for the next few slides, I'll provide some of the key findings that informed our ORV determinations. Each slide contains a few excerpts from our River Values report, and we provided a link to that report in the handout for this webinar. For scenery to start, both Wasson Creek and Franklin Creek had that ORV. And for methodology, our project team reviewed photos taken at various locations along both creeks, as well as staff in-person site visits to the project area. And as we were reviewing these images, we really noticed how the creek's water features, surrounding undisturbed vegetation, topography, and geology all came together to create a striking visual setting centered on the creek itself. In analyzing this scenery within the context of the region of comparison, we concluded that these scenic settings were exemplary of the creek-based scenery you'd see in the Oregon Coast Range, particularly for Devil's Staircase Waterfall. The combination of the water features and the surrounding scenery created a noteworthy and exemplary scenic feature. And not only were the scenic features exemplary, it was also rare within the region of comparison to see this combination of visual features in an undisturbed old growth setting. Especially again for Wasson Creek, it's rare to see such a long undisturbed scenic corridor of around 10 miles in the region of comparison. So all of these factors influenced our finding of a scenic, outstanding, remarkable value for both creeks. For Wasson Creek, our initial research actually suggested that there wasn't a recreation ORV, but when we reviewed the external feedback after our preliminary workshop, and when we took a closer look at the information that had been published by non-agency sources, we really started to recognize how much the visitors to Wasson Creek value that wilderness backcountry recreation experience. And that experience was centered on the creek, specifically the journey to the Devil's Staircase, and then the experience of viewing and exploring the waterfall once you get there. And when we took a step back again and looked at Wasson Creek in the context of the region of comparison, we recognized that its recreation setting was exemplary of that wilderness experience in the Oregon Coast Range, especially thinking about the steep, rugged descent to the creeks, lack of trails, reliance on backcountry skills, and excellent opportunities for solitude. And then the waterfall itself functions as a sort of classic creek-based backcountry recreation destination. We also recognized it was rare to encounter this type of challenging and immersive wilderness setting in our region of comparison, especially as a trailless area. Then on the other hand, Franklin Creek had the same setting, but it was not attracting the same level of use or attention or recognition among the recreation community. So we couldn't justify recreation ORV for Franklin Creek based on the visitation and the general public interest we were seeing. So for fish habitat and populations at Wasson Creek, we looked at the high quality riparian and aquatic habitat, which supported a wide range of native fish, and determined that it was exemplary of the fish habitat settings in our region of comparison. We also determined that it was rare in the region of comparison to have such a long continuous corridor of that high quality fish habitat. Again, getting at that habitat connectivity idea. The Wild and Scenic River segment is upstream of additional critical habitats for threatened and sensitive fish species. And as part of our ORV determination, we acknowledged that the Wild and Scenic River itself was supporting those downstream habitats by providing a steady input of cold and clean water. It's really important for fish spawning and rearing. And then for the fish populations piece, within the Wild and Scenic River segment, we decided that the segment was regionally important because of its population of several sensitive species. And our fish biologists were also really excited about the creek's cutthroat trout population because it was isolated behind a waterfall fairly low in the drainage. And that was a rare finding to see that sort of isolated trout population within the region of comparison. And then for Franklin Creek, the ORV determination is based on the presence of threatened and sensitive fish populations, including coho, Pacific lamprey, and steelhead. Another key aspect of the ORV is the undisturbed and high quality fish habitat, including important features such as high concentrations of large woody debris and high quality pools and riffles. Once again, this high quality fish habitat is exemplary within the region of comparison, even though Franklin Creek's habitat corridor is not as long as Wasson Creek's per se. Beaver habitat was another ORV for both creeks. When the interdisciplinary team was discussing wildlife, beaver habitat emerged as something that distinguished both creeks from their peers in the region of comparison. Field surveys have found evidence of beaver occupancy throughout the length of both creeks. And the attributes of both drainages creates high quality and exemplary habitat for the beavers that occupy the area. And of course, that beaver habitat is river dependent. And then another key element of the ORV determination is the fact that beaver habitat is declining within the region of comparison. And beaver is an important species for the ecology of the Coast Range. So looking at that declining habitat, the significance of the species, combined with the exemplary habitat in Wasson Creek and Franklin Creek. That led us to a determination of an ORV for both creeks there. So lastly, ecological systems. The interdisciplinary team felt that the entire ecosystem of Wasson Creek and Franklin Creek merited recognition as an ORV itself beyond the traditional sort of siloed ORV category. Because stepping back and looking at the ecosystem as a whole, it was clear that we were dealing with a temperate coastal rainforest ecosystem that was exemplary of the undisturbed ecology of the Oregon Coast Range. And those ecological systems and interconnections between the components were providing a wide range of habitat benefits for plants and fish, and wildlife, as well as numerous ecosystem services for humans. I don't have a lot of time to get into that one because I'm running short, but this was one kind of in that other category that we recognized there was a need for this sort of holistic ORV, and we worked to develop criteria and then a determination that made sense based on what we were seeing in our project area. So really quick, just some desired conditions. Once we had our current conditions and our river value determinations, we were able to start working on our desired conditions. As Liz mentioned, those desired condition statements convey how the agencies want things to look in the future. Sometimes desired conditions look different than the current conditions, and sometimes desired conditions focus on maintaining the status quo. And that was really more the case for Wasson and Franklin, is maintaining the existing wilderness setting and maintaining the river values in their current state. So in that respect, desired conditions serve as targets to help the agency, to guide agency management decisions. So in the Wasson Creek and Franklin Creek Comprehensive Plan, we have at least one desired condition statement for each of our river values, and I've included a few examples here on the slide. We have one for recreation at Wasson Creek. We have an ecological desired condition for both creeks. And then we have a combined scenery and ecological desired condition for both creeks there. Sometimes they kind of double up, and you can accommodate multiple ORVs with a single desired condition statement. And again, these desired conditions are critical parts of the plan because they help guide our management decisions toward the realization or maintenance of these river value settings. So then lastly, our outstanding remarkable value determinations and desired conditions statements inform the monitoring program and the management actions in our comprehensive plan. For Wasson Creek and Franklin Creek, we didn't identify any river value degradation occurring at this time. So with that in mind, because most of the project area is in wilderness, we are not proposing any management actions to protect or enhance river values right away. However, we are continuing to complete baseline inventory assessments for invasive plants and road conditions, and we may propose management actions at a later date based on those findings. Perhaps we'll find that invasive plant treatments or road rehabilitation projects are needed based on those assessments we're still doing. We're also implementing a visitor use monitoring program where we're monitoring for various indicators of visitor use and visitor use impacts. Those indicators include the footprints or bare soil areas of dispersed campsites, visitor encounters at parking lots and trails, and then visitor impacts such as soil erosion or trash at recreation attractions such as Wasson Lake or the Devil Staircase waterfall. That monitoring may reveal river value degradation at some point in the future. And if that ends up being the case, we've identified management actions in our comprehensive plan that could be implemented to correct that river value degradation if our monitoring shows that the degradation is happening. And the specific choice of management action depends on the location and nature of the degradation that we're seeing. So again, that's all for me. Thanks for listening, and I think I'll turn it back to Angie to close us out.
Thanks, Trevor. And thanks, Liz and Steve, for these awesome presentations. And so We do have a little bit of time for some questions. So if you have a question, again, you can type it into that question box. One that I did see come in earlier when you were presenting, Steve, was asking, is the process/rationale document the FEIS of the river designation? I don't know. If you need more context, we can ask Monique to provide some more context.
So if it's for a designated river, the comprehensive river management plan is typically supported by some sort of NEPA document. It's not always an environmental impact statement. Oftentimes it's an environmental assessment or an EA document, and so there would be some documentation in there. There might also be supplemental reports, like Trevor was referencing, the river values report, in the context of river eligibility, which oftentimes within the Forest Service takes place within the land management planning process or forest plan revision. Then there also would likely be a river values report or an eligibility report documenting the ORV assessments that would likely be an attachment to the EIS. Yeah.
Thanks, Steve. And then while we're waiting, again, we have a few minutes for any other questions, so type them into that question box if you have any questions for our presenters. I also wanted to share that we've got coming up on June 15th, the last webinar in this webinar series, and we're going to be looking at steps to address user capacities. So if you haven't already, I encourage you to go register for that.
Angie, did we have any guesses on the literary heritage ORV?
Great question. The only one I saw come in was said it's not a river, but what about Walden Pond?
Same part of the world, but the correct answer is the Sudbury, Assabet, and Concord rivers in Massachusetts, designated in 1999 and administered as a partnership Wild and Scenic River by the National Park Service, state of Massachusetts, and local government.
And then I'm curious also, I did not see any guesses come in for the band or the song or the video for the ORV video that you posted.
So that would be the Scottish band Big Country.
Okay.
And their hit In a Big Country, featured in that clip.
And then someone asked, can you reiterate or elaborate on the purpose of the region of comparison?
Liz or Trevor want to take this one?
Go ahead, Steve.
I'll just say, especially for Wasson and Franklin, it was about picking an analysis area where we would compare the attributes of our designated wild and scenic rivers to their peers, to other rivers and creeks, to see if the attributes of the wild and scenic rivers we were evaluating rose to the thresholds of rare, unique, or exemplary compared to other rivers and creeks. So it's that kind of qualitative comparison that really underlies the ORV determination. And so for the case study I just presented, our region of comparison was a portion of the Oregon Coast Range where the biophysical and social attributes were fairly well aligned, but still left for quite a bit of variation in the current conditions.
So this result, I'll chime in that the region of comparison can vary by river. So it was intended to be a helpful tool for both the public and for as a management tool to figure out, okay, what would we do to protect it? One thing that has complicated life, I think, for some of the agency folks in their comprehensive river management planning now is with Dingle Act designations where they're in, unlike on the Rogue, 36 tributaries. If there's an attribute that's really important, it can't be in with the region comparison can't be defined such that the next tributary, which is really close by, may or may not be included. So I think there's discussion in some of the new designations, but that's the intention, to help you define it so that you can manage to it in a plan.
All right. Well, it looks like we've come to the end of our time today. So again, I just want to thank our presenters today. Here's their contact information. You can also find it in the handout. I'll also be putting PDF copy of the handout along with the recording. So look for that in the next 24 hours from me. And other than that, I just want to say thanks again for joining us today. And we hope to see you on the 15th at the last one in the series. So thanks, everyone.